This is a film about climate change and corporate leadership, not in the West, but in India, where the economy and the people are profoundly vulnerable unless action is taken now. But why should we be interested in what's happening in corporate India? Because it's in countries such as China and India where the next chapter of the climate change story is being written. My name is Malini Mehra and I'm a climate campaigner. I'm also part of a new generation of Indians for whom climate change is our generational challenge. Countries such as China and India already have the largest populations in the world. We also have amongst the largest emissions in the world. This is an issue about our future and the decisions that we take. Will we act in time? If we don't, then we won't be able to make the transition to a society that's capable of protecting its citizens and the environment. Where will that leadership come from, however? Where will the innovators come from who will prevent us from making the mistakes of the West? Our work suggests that Indian companies and Indian entrepreneurs are ready to play a big role. This is their story. This is a story about climate heroes, Indian style. In December this year, 190 governments will be meeting in Copenhagen to agree a way forward on climate change. 2009 could turn out to be the most important year in human history. Recent climate science presents a very alarming picture. The planet is warming up faster than expected. Polar ice caps are melting and the capacity of our oceans to absorb carbon dioxide emissions is diminishing. If we don't act fast, our days are numbered. At the Copenhagen Climate Summit, governments will come together to agree a new way forward on climate change. They will have to agree a new framework agreement on the issue, the so-called Global Deal on Climate Change. This isn't the first time governments are meeting to discuss climate change. They've met under the umbrella of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change 14 times before. But 2009 is different. The Minister for Energy and Climate Change of the host government, Denmark, explains why.
It's a deadline that 192 countries set up. We must come to an agreement in 2009 at the latest. Why? Because else the consequences only grow worse. Now we must take the difficult political decisions. The tough choices are to be made now. There is no discussion that developed countries, they will have to deliver most and first. But in the end, the calculations, the equation will not go up unless also the major economies among the developing countries somehow contribute. But the only growth that the world, that the planet can afford, that is sustainable growth.
In 1997, the United Nations agreed the Kyoto Protocol. This is an agreement that mandated very modest emissions cuts from some industrialized countries. At the time, developing countries such as China and India were exempt from making mandatory emissions reductions. The situation is different now. Emissions are rising. Indeed, they have been rising for the last 10 years at a faster rate than before. And we see that those countries which have been required to make cuts have not been making them. The focus, however, has been very much on governments. For the last 15 years, governments have been coming to the United Nations meetings and negotiated in their favorite clubs, whether it's the European Union, whether it's the G77 and China, the grouping that includes India, or whether it's the alliance of small island states. The focus has been on countries negotiating as a bloc. The position of the government of India is well known.
We look upon the issue of climate change from a somewhat broader perspective than merely an issue of carbon emissions. Development, which is essential for poverty eradication in our country, must go hand in hand with environmental protection with environmental safeguards. It is the accumulated greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere which are causing climate change, and not merely and not primarily, in fact, current emissions. One of the major challenges that we would be facing is really how to adapt to climate change which has already taken place. The group of developing countries who are engaged in these negotiations would like to have an ambitious outcome from Copenhagen. It should also be equitable. We have suggested, why don't we get together as developed countries and some of the emerging countries and really collaborate on, in a sense, disruptive technologies which can really bring about an accelerated shift from a carbon-based economy to a renewable-based economy. If there is to be an accelerated adjustment, who pays? Those who are primarily responsible for climate change which is taking place have the chief responsibility to deal with this challenge and help the developing countries embark on a path of sustainable development. Not as aid, but as entitlements.
The view that the problem is not of India's making and that India is a victim requiring financial compensation is deep-seated. Government officials emphasize the minuscule nature of India's contributions to global emissions, a mere 4% compared to the 16% of China and the United States. And indeed, they emphasize the inequity of expecting a country with such a small per capita carbon footprint to do much more.
India is doing a lot more on the ground, much more than what it can afford to do, despite the fact that India is not a signatory to climate change negotiations, in which under Kyoto Protocol there are only Annex 1 countries who are supposed to reduce their emissions. India is not Annex 1 country. India's per capita emissions are 20 times lower than that of Europe, maybe 40 times lower of that of United States. But India, therefore, is not anywhere in the league of the polluter that it is alleged to be. Glaciers in Himalayas are retreating not because of India doing something in India which is causing that. There is something happening globally which is causing retreat of glaciers in Himalayas. Action has to be initiated there, no doubt about that. But look at who has to help that action. The action has to be facilitated, supported and activated by all the countries of the world, because this is something which has happened because of past emission. It's a historical responsibility. Then we have insurgency, we have terrorism, so we have to divert resources for that. How do we, in situation like this, find resources to deal with a daunting challenge of this magnitude?
Little is said in this debate, however, of India's own growing emissions and the fact that even if all developed countries were to stop emitting tomorrow, we would still be locked into decades of climate change. At the United Nations and in civil society worldwide, there is a growing fear that a deal will not be made in Copenhagen, that governments will not get their act together in time. For the victims of climate change, the United Nations bloc politics are a hindrance, not a help. According to the former president of the Maldives, President Gayoom, he puts it thus.
The Maldives is a very unique country. We have a unique history, a unique culture, a unique language which is not spoken anywhere else in the world. So we want to keep our heritage. Our country is very low-lying. The land rises only about 3.5 to 5 feet above mean sea level. So in case of any rise in sea levels, even 40 centimeters or more, that will mean a lot of damage to our country, to our soil, infrastructure and agriculture and so many other things. So I think it's very important that all countries of the world come to a common ground in face of climate change and agree on specific targets to be followed by everyone without any exception.
India as a country is acutely vulnerable to climate impacts. Most of our vast rural population will be affected by the highly climate-sensitive dependencies that they have on our resources such as forests, fisheries and of course agriculture. Indeed, many of the people here who are working the soil, those who are sailing in our waters and those who are working in our forests, will be the first and the worst hit by climate change. Climate impacts will hit everything, from India's water and energy security to our public health and food production, from our environment to our biodiversity, and of course also our jobs, our livelihoods, and the entire broader economy.
Well, the impact of climate change, particularly changes in temperature and precipitation, as well as sea level, they will have very adverse impact on millions of people in this country. Our food security will suffer, our water security will suffer, our livelihood security systems, which are based upon natural resources, land and water, will suffer. So it is disastrous consequences, particularly when our population is still growing and we are likely to overtake China in terms of total numbers in another 30 years. 1.5 billion is what is anticipated now. Who is going to feed us? Who is going to give us water? Also, about 25% of India's population live within 50 kilometers of shoreline. The tsunami of December 26, 2004 was a wake-up call. It led to a lot of loss of life in the coastal states and of Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So we are very vulnerable. If the Himalayan snows melts, if the glaciers recede, floods will become more common in the Indo-Gangetic plains, which is very heavily populated, very heavily populated. But it's also the breadbasket of our country. Similarly, temperature changes will affect the dry areas very much more, because already the high temperature. Further high temperature will lead to the evaporation of water from the ground. The groundwater table will go down. And also our rivers and so on will get dry.
Climate impacts won't be felt in some distant future. They're being felt right now. Professor Shugata Hazra, one of the country's leading oceanographers at Jadavpur University, has been studying the impacts of climate change on one of India's most prominent climate hotspots, the Sundarbans.
We are observing there is a 0.019 degrees centigrade per year temperature rise of sea surface temperature anomaly. So you may say that there will be a 2 degrees centigrade rise from the sea surface temperature in 100 years. We have lost 2 islands called Lohachora and Supari Bhanga. We have identified 13 vulnerable islands in the southern part of Sundarban Delta. So Goramara is inhabited, Shagor is inhabited, Pathor Pratima is inhabited. So these islands will lose around 15 to 30% of land in the coming 30 years. You can understand the threat. 4.5 million people. If 39% of them is below poverty line, if they don't have coping capacity, if they don't have health, education, how they will fight the rising intensity of cyclones and the coastal erosion, and how they will survive in the climate change scenario. Even if you are losing the tiger habitat like Bhanga Duani or the Dalhousie Islands, there is an increasing man-animal conflict. We are losing the biodiversity.
In this situation, more and more voices, from Al Gore to Ban Ki-moon's, are turning to business to see whether business, with its grand talk of corporate responsibility and sustainability, can make the difference, to see whether it can actually cut through some of the politicization of the discussion and lead more pragmatic solutions.
You are the pioneers of Indian economic development, and I count on you to become again a pioneer in leading these climate change issues. Industrialists here have moved forward on new energy technologies. I would encourage you to intensify this work and engage even more with other international efforts in this field. It is time for another bold step. We need your ideas, your investment, and we need your innovation, and we need your can-do spirit. We need you to use your influence to press governments to do their part for a deal in Copenhagen. I'm counting on more than your support. I'm counting on your leadership.
This pro-business view is very new. I was at Kyoto in 1997 where a different mood prevailed. As NGOs, we were skeptical of business, saw them on the wrong side of the argument, and indeed gave them a Scorched Earth Award for their pains. Since then, groups such as the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the World Economic Forum and the Global Compact have emerged to make a persuasive business case for action on climate change. We have the example of the UK's Corporate Leaders Group, which peeled away from mainstream business to ask for a proactive leadership agenda on climate change. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, where many of our own industrialists frequent, climate change is one of the most spoken about and discussed issues. For global business, the penny has dropped. Climate change is now seen as a big business risk. But it's also seen as a huge economic opportunity if handled the right way. So much of what we hear about leadership on climate change is about Western business. Where are the Indian Richard Bransons, the BTs, the game changers such as GE and Walmart? As the economic center of gravity shifts eastwards, we're beginning to see the emergence of multinational corporations in the East, in countries such as China and India. In the decade from 1990 to 2000, we saw their numbers grow from 3,000 to 13,000. If we're serious about sustainability and climate change, it's these companies that we have to talk of, the future BPs and the Nikes. Ancient nations such as India and China have been trading for more than 5,000 years. Already 400 years ago, they were major global players with the largest economies in the world. Indian cities such as Surat were even richer than many European cities. This tradition of entrepreneurship and trading is continued through the great diasporas of India and China, with more than 20 million Indians in the diaspora and more than 40 million in the Chinese diaspora. This program is about a journey around India, speaking with some of the men and the women at the helm of India's companies who can help us meet the climate challenge. A good place to start is Calcutta. Now renamed Kolkata, the city was home to the East India Company, the world's first joint stock corporation and the precursor to the modern corporation. The East India Company survived for more than 250 years, but became known as the byword for corporate greed and rapaciousness. Now little survives of the company except relics on Kolkata's thoroughfare of Chaurangi. On the other side of Chaurangi, one can find the modern inheritors of the company, the giant ITC. Formerly known as the Indian Tobacco Corporation, ITC has its headquarters here in Calcutta. It's now a highly diversified global firm, employing indirectly more than 5 million people. Its chief executive, Yogi Deveshwar, was one of the first to sound the alarm in corporate India on sustainability and climate change issues.
Everybody has to get engaged, particularly business, because business has got so many touch points with society. And not only because it has financial resource, but it has the managerial resource that is much more important in being able to counter this threat. And government is to create a policy framework so that it recognizes those who make a contribution. It begins to provide incentives to those who make a contribution. So far, the return has been measured only in financial terms. But what it has done to degradation of our natural capital has not been accounted for. So every company has to now make transparent as to what are the implications on financial capital formation, on social capital formation, and also on ecological capital formation, so that even consumers can be educated about the contribution a company makes. Ultimate revolution will come when consumers are empowered with the information as to who is good for them. We cannot keep on doing the old things and meet the new challenges. We have to create a totally new definition of purposes of business. We need to create a new definition of corporate governance. We need to create a new definition of public-private people partnership. And we need to create totally new systems of reward and punishment.
India is a country of great diversity. One of the communities that has made it their own and founded some of the finest industrial houses in India is the Parsi community. The Parsis or Zoroastrians fled persecution in Iran 250 years ago and migrated to India. One of these immigrant families was the Tatas. The Tatas can indeed be credited with laying the foundations of modern India. They gave us the country's first steel mill, the first luxury hotel, the first airline, the first research institute, and even the Nano, the first 1 lakh car in India. Established in the 1890s, the group was founded by visionary industrialist J.N. Tata, avowedly on a nation-building platform. Tata Steel, now better known throughout the world since its acquisition of Chorus, had already, before many other parts of the world, instituted major labor reform programs, such as the 8-hour workday and maternity benefits for women. Now J.J. Irani, the former head of Tata Steel, heads up the group-wide committee on climate change.
Main, shall we say, emphasis of our attempt up to now has been to find out, in a way, how guilty we are or where do we stand. We realized that as an industry or industries, we were probably not doing what we could. we have all the policies that are shall we say necessary in the country. They are good policies. We are not short on policies. What we are short on is their implementation. So we would go ahead and do our bit to implement it, whether the others or the government do it or not. And I don't think we will go into an international forum saying that this is as Tatas. We will go into an international forum as a member of a group of Indian industries. We will support them. Without an awareness of climate change, the alternative is quite dark and dismal. In fact, there is no alternative.
Another illustrious Parsi business house is Godrej. Established in the late 1800s, the founder patented one of the world's most formidable locks, and even now Indians swear by Godrej locks and steel almirahs. The group now is diversified across a wide range. They sell everything from consumer durables and appliances to real estate. They are also strong environmentalists and indeed manage a refuge of mangroves, 3,000 acres of endangered trees outside their plant in Vikhroli. Jamshed Godrej is a descendant of the founder. He's an ardent environmentalist and has led the movement within CII, the Confederation of Indian Industries, towards climate consciousness.
All our businesses have been given the mission that sustainability has to be a part of their agenda. Our main thrust with government is that over time we have to move from a more voluntary system to a more regulated system. We are taking this with the government on two levels. One is what industry can do by itself and where industry will actually benefit by doing it and where government intervention is minimal. The second is actually on government intervention in terms of policy. On policy, we would like to see the government bring in policy which is challenging for industry and for society, but do it in a gradual way. The issue is so vast that you have to break it down to levels which can actually be addressed. So you should first of all address it industry-wise. So that whole work of planning has to be done, and that's where industry works very closely with government today. Basically, I think we have to talk of sustainable development and break it down into simple issues, which then will lead through all those little simple issues being added up, will eventually lead to mitigation and adaptation on climate change. I'm not so worried on industry. I think industry will very much come forward because it becomes a competitiveness issue. India is well positioned to understand and experiment with different ideas, try them all out, and then see which works. I think the world developed in a particular way. Okay? India has to develop in a totally different way. Because we have a large population and because people are today not consuming, this gives us that opportunity. For a government like India, I mean, in a global climate deal, they have to be clear that the issue of equity must come first.
Nandan Nilekani from Infosys is another business leader with a passion for climate change and a desire to make his company carbon neutral.
We have taken this thing very seriously, and a year or two back we decided that we would be at the cutting edge of sustainability in our own business. First of all, we must present an approach to development which combines the aspirations of people with sustainable development. And when we are at the early stages of this development, if we can change the whole paradigm, we can actually come out winners, because we don't have the legacy problems of the rich countries. We can actually create a much better development model, a much more sustainable model, and actually a much more competitive model. And given that India's solutions have to be high volume, low cost, high quality, and green, I think you will see a lot of entrepreneurial activity which generate these solutions. But the sort of the framework of incentives have to be in place. I think we have to work on multiple fronts. We have to work on renewables, we have to work on the grid, we have to work on creating a culture, we have to look at the whole issue of water, we have to look at the issue of subsidies. Because in India, every subsidy, in some sense, is environmentally unfriendly. We must be signaling that creating a sustainable green India, marrying development and sustainability, preparing for a post-carbon economy is in our strategic interest. We have to find ways of making it also politically resonant so that it becomes part of the political conversations. Today it's not. So that's the domestic challenge. And globally, I think we have to show the world that we have taken ourselves proactively a strategy to go green. In fact, we are doing many more things than what they are asking, because
we think it's in our interest. At the same time, given the fact that 50% of the stock has come from the rich countries, given the fact that we are at 2 tons per person, whereas Europe is at 12 and the US at 20, there is an issue of equity, and therefore whatever deal is struck must be equitable for India to endorse it.
India's IT leaders have moved quickly to position themselves as carbon literate climate champions. Wipro, the largest IT firm in India, has set itself stretching targets for water and carbon neutrality.
We have at least 15,000 of our engineers who are directly involved in product design, and many of them are high-tech products, and many of them do telecommunication work and things like that. So how to make the products green is one of the design features that goes into it. How can we reduce not only the carbon content, but how can we reduce power consumption? Companies like Wipro can take leadership even in the area of green, and making sure that we not only make ourselves role models in what we do internally, but also help many of our clients actually improve their carbon footprint. So you can reduce cost and kind of tide over the troubled economic times. At the same time, you can make the world more sustainable by just reducing the amount of carbon footprint that you generate. We create awareness both globally as well as in India, so that the governments understand that businesses are aligned to the goal that we have set ourselves as humanity. And business is not pulling in the other direction as we have seen in some other countries, but we are actually encouraging the government to step forward and to make this a more habitable planet.
The experience of many Western multinationals on the climate agenda is beginning to be internalized and taken up by the Indian leadership. HSBC India's first female chief executive, Naina Lal Kidwai, leads the pack. With verve and with a passion for detail, she is beginning to get the bank to walk the climate talk.
The opportunity for organizations such as ours that are very deeply entrenched in India, in India's success, in India's businesses, can only benefit from the next wave of investment, which has to be in the space of climate change. The opportunity for companies is to invest in these spaces. Small companies could pick up some of these technologies and distribute them. Large companies could be manufacturing these technologies. Banks like ours would be there to fund it. Microfinance institutions, which are now becoming quite strong in India, could be the delivery mechanisms to rural India. So if we can get the right technologies into the hands with the buying power that is now available in rural India, we do have a very interesting industry story. If we can continue to place before our corporate clients the opportunities that exist, they take the decisions in terms of what they can do best, and we stand behind them, helping them fund it, then we've got a win-win solution.
Hindustan Unilever, the Indian arm of Unilever, also has an Indian at the helm, Nitin Paranjpe. He's seeking to leverage the company's technical expertise to produce the next generation of low-carbon, sustainable products for the Indian household.
We are building in the gate process of decision making criteria which will enable us to assess and understand the impact of that on climate change. Studying the life cycle analysis of different brands which we introduce, what is the impact of that, and putting in the mechanism by which we systematically reduce the footprint and the impact that we will have on issues related to climate change. A great example is the breakthrough which we had in how we make soap. We developed what we now call the Plowshare mixer. The Plowshare mixer significantly reduces the energy consumption in soap making because it doesn't require steam. Now that was a significant breakthrough, reducing something like 15,000 tons per annum of carbon dioxide. And in laundry, we discovered that an incredibly large amount of water was consumed in the rinsing of the product after the wash. And by designing the product with ingredients, with a different set of active ingredients, we formulated a product which would reduce water consumption, reduce for rinsing by half. We believe our brands will be the carriers of social change, the harbingers of social change. And we would drive our research teams, our development teams, our marketers to be able to think about propositions, develop products which will reduce water consumption per se.
For firms like Shell in India, the challenge to go green is far more complex and controversial.
I used to be a mountaineer when I was younger, and I still have a home in the mountains of, well, in the foothills of the Himalayas. I didn't need to read books about the impact or the changes that were taking place in the environment. What I needed to read about was the reasons for those changes, and now it's become much clearer to me that it's not just simply natural. It's not nature that's caused this. It is human beings that have caused this, and that we need to do something to arrest this. Otherwise, our children are going to be confronted with a very dirty world.
If India is to have a low-carbon future, shifting fossil fuel giants such as Shell will have to be part of the equation.
Well, our company has a three-pronged approach towards supporting the government in its endeavor towards a green vision. One is that we are prepared to support them in technology-related issues. Secondly, we are involved with the development of sustainable forms of energy in India through our foundation called Shell Foundation. Thirdly, we are engaged in many of the policy-making groups, or we are part of many of the policy-making groups that contribute towards the development of the national policy. We make sure that in everything that we do with the government of India and with our various projects, we're bringing to bear on those projects the latest technologies, and that they are consistent with our endeavor to actually develop clean fuels.
The power sector and industry account for the majority of India's greenhouse gas emissions, but transportation is also a major challenge. The greenhouse gas emissions from India's cars and vehicles is now becoming a real challenge for the country. Unlike 2 decades ago, consumers today have a plethora of choice if they can afford to purchase a private car. There is, of course, the Tata Nano on the market, the cheapest car around perhaps. But industrial groups such as the Mahindras have their eyes set on a green SUV. Anand Mahindra is another green industrialist who sees little tension between his role as a vehicle manufacturer and real estate developer and his desire to be an eco-warrior.
Nothing will succeed unless this has gripped the heart of the corporation. And by the heart, I mean the mindset, the real conviction. And that rests with top leadership. You have to build it or knit it into the competitive logic of your company. It has to become indispensable, which means that your products or your services have to incorporate some kind of differentiation based on your position in the climate. Hence our green SUVs and our green vehicles, our green tractors. Hence the fact that we renamed our real estate development company Mahindra Lifespaces. Long before the green movement became, let's say, a popular movement, we had already instituted every single device that was necessary in order to capture our pollutants. We were way ahead of the standards required by the local governments to do that. So I think across the board we have a variety of initiatives, to illustrate the point, which are already integrating a green differentiation into our consumer face. I'm saying set the standards for pollution, for pollutants, and then leave it into the private sector innovation and enterprise to create products and technologies that meet those standards. So do not mandate technology, mandate the level of emissions that you are going to want. And then, as I said, have regulations which are clear, transparent, consistent, and equitable. There is no room for paranoia and for separating the East and the West. I think in India, and I dare say in China, we are just as concerned about the future for our children as anyone else.
For many in India, the real answer to their mobility needs will only come through non-fossil fuel-based private cars and vastly improved public transportation systems. Chetan Maini is a new type of auto manufacturer who believes in both. He shows his staff Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, and he also happens to manufacture the world's best-selling electric car.
City mobility, especially in India, China, and a lot of the growing countries, needed solutions that were very environment friendly. So my interest always was trying to work towards that area. We have 10 global patents, mainly in the energy management space, that are today property of REWA, and we continue to apply for several new patents in this area. Initially, it was trying to prove out that companies in India could create new products and technologies in the green space. Anyone joining REWA goes through an orientation program, which is conducted by me, and in the first hour, most of it is talking about climate change and the effects of it, and what we are doing as an organization to help that. There wasn't a regulation for electric cars in India, so we had to work with the regulatory agencies to create the framework to have electric cars and sell them in the country and test them. What are the test procedures for it? We had a very changing framework of taxation policies at the initial days, which made it very hard because there wasn't a structured long-term thought process within the government. Consumers were trying to understand, what about this new product? But we really believe that long-term transportation will move to virtual mobility. If you're going to have solutions in cities, they have to move to being electric, and not just in cars. It's got to be electric cars, electric two-wheelers, electric metro systems, everything integrated to give you a solution. You need a lot of investments in research and development. This needs to be in universities, as well as in the government, as well as public and private sector companies. Once the policies come in, we need sectoral bodies to look at how we can structure such things, so then it creates a new infrastructure and an opportunity for India in a new segment.
Chetan Maini is part of a dynamic new breed of young Indian entrepreneur. Foreign educated, environmentally conscious, these 30 and 40-somethings are out to change the way business is done in India. Shagun Saxena of Reganistar and Amit Chugh of Cosmos Ignite embody this new breed of ecopreneur.
We've spent the last 4 years developing solutions that we can bring to Indian companies to help them reduce their carbon footprints. We can use their existing infrastructure and give them a remarkable carbon emissions reduction, while also ensuring that they can get a long-term cost benefit. We're also seeing a lot of interest in the rural areas, as many farmers and agricultural processors in rural areas suffer from diesel shortages and want to use fuel that's available locally.
We are attempting to innovate on 3 broad areas. One is to bring disruptive technologies. Second is in the business model, which is a for-profit attempt instead of just the drip feed of government actions and charities alone. And the third is to do this as an international bridge between the so-called West and the developing world.
Primary motivation for me is the opportunity to play a role in addressing 2 of the biggest challenges that we face in India. One is the area of climate change, the other is still poverty.
This dangerous polluting fuel of kerosene, which indeed does not even percolate down to the targeted beneficiaries it is intended for. The annual subsidy in this country alone is to the tune of $8 billion. And what we think, for a fraction of 1 year's subsidy, these 450 million people can all be given light. If you do wish to subsidize, it ought to be for new technologies which truly empower people. You allow an ecosystem to develop where affordability is looked at through financial institutions as well as the governments in terms of low-cost funding, patient capital, financing with a longer payback period, etc. I would say that as entrepreneurs or green entrepreneurs, we definitely like a voice.
As an entrepreneur focused on the clean tech sector in India, I want to see our Indian negotiators be very bold in Copenhagen. I want to see that they protect the interests of the vulnerable industry sectors and communities in India, but that they also trust in the capabilities of entrepreneurs and businesses in India to come up with the innovations, to start bringing these technologies to the market in India. And by doing this, by being bold, the negotiators create the market for these technologies around the world that Indian companies can be successful in serving.
At a time when it seems that green is the new black, solar has definitely got to be the new gold. Solar energy is enjoying an unprecedented resurgence in India. With support of the likes of the Prime Minister, who has pledged himself to India going solar, we have the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which includes solar energy as one of its key 8 missions. There is good reason to be optimistic about solar in India. Experts say that if we dedicate just 1% of our land area to solar, we can power the entire country's electricity needs up to 2030. One of the reasons for this mood of confidence has got to be the hard yards put in already by India's solarpreneurs, the entrepreneurs who've done more than most to put solar on the map. People like the trio of Harish Hande from Selco, Dr. Deepak and Shirin Gadhia from Gujarat, and Dr. Gon Chaudhary from West Bengal, who really put solar on India's energy map.
It's a group of 20-25 houses in a village where we have provided 2 light system, 1 LED and 1 CFL for night lighting, and they have also got street lights in the outside of on the road so that they have common area lighting. Previously they were all using kerosene as a primary source of lighting, so it's a complete leap, one step in terms from kerosene to much reliable, safer and cleaner form of lighting. If you look at the poor, it's not only the willpower, it's the basic infrastructure. How do you create doorstep service mechanisms? How do you create doorstep financing mechanisms to provide solar energy so that people don't? That will take long, and appropriate technologies for the poor to actually adapt to increase their income or usage. That's going to take time, and we as in India or China have to see that as a bigger threat than anything else. The Copenhagen is not addressing to that client base, and to create appropriate renewable energy technologies takes time. And today India, I think, is wrongly pointing fingers towards the West. You clean up first. Irrespective whether the West cleans up, we are not solving our own problems. So it's scary for me that we're all looking at the West or looking at the rich to come up with a solution, but what happens to the 650 million people in India and elsewhere in Africa and Latin America? We need to provide solutions for them today, otherwise it's going to be a disaster in the rural areas, it's going to be a disaster in the poor areas, and I don't think so there's any other solution but to provide sustainable energies for them.
Across in Gujarat, Shirin and Deepak Gadhia have been working for more than 30 years to make solar the technology of choice for everything from cooking to lighting to heating in both urban and rural India.
We have done a lot of projects in Andhra Pradesh and also in Tamil Nadu. So there are 4 smoke-free villages there. Solar cooking is okay once to save the environment and so on, but the women, they wouldn't want to spend any money on a cooker or so on. So we have introduced this element of income generation. Schools in India, urban schools can have a cooker or 2 and generate income to buy cookers for rural schools. Even urban women's groups like Rotarians and Lions and all, they should also take up such an initiative. Have a cooker or 2, generate income, and then start donating cookers to villages.
More recently, Deepak Gadhia has been breaking barriers and taboos to develop the country's first and the world's first solar crematoria.
The idea of solar crematorium came from a man who cannot read and write. He said, wow, that's great, can you burn bodies with it? So we said, look, uncle, it's possible to do that, but will people accept it? We are finding it difficult to people to change from normal cooking to solar cooking. Now we are talking of solar crematorium, so it's not just about disposing body, it is about these rituals, it is about soul, it is about religion, it is about feelings. So we think people will not accept it. But he said, look, you are a technocrat, I am a social scientist, that's our role, let me do it and you take care of the technology. And now it has shown us that if you want to bring in technology, not only economy or ecology, but even the spiritual way is the way to bring it forward. The local resistance is no more there.
Over in West Bengal, Dr. Gon Chaudhary can be credited with having made West Bengal one of the country's most climate vulnerable states into a renewable energy hotspot. The state now boasts the country's first 2-megawatt solar power plant, its first solar housing complex, as well as shortly its first solar power island in the ecologically fragile Sundarbans.
In India, we don't have any single, megawatt level power plant. So we thought, let us have a 2-megawatt power plant, first megawatt level power plant in the country, and we are putting up this plant in Asansol area, and India will shift from coal age to solar age. So far, India has done significant work in off-grid application of renewable energy. Our installed capacity is about 9,000 megawatt now, out of 146,000 megawatt installed capacity of power. In this sector, we have got a lot of private players now. We have Sundarbans. The people of Sundarban, they realize that yes, let us jump from no electricity to clean electricity, no in between. They were paying even 6-7 rupees per kilowatt hour for green energy because they didn't have any other option. In Calcutta, we have set up the first solar housing complex of the country. These are all rooftop solar PV and building integrated PV with grid connectivity. The project has been constructed by the government, but the investment has come from the private people. After seeing that, interestingly, 2 big promoters, developers, housing developer,
they have come up with the idea that they will go for a much bigger, much larger scale housing complex with solar BIPV type of thing.
These climate heroes are not isolated examples. Across India, one finds pockets of entrepreneurs, business people and professionals who are seeking to place the concern for sustainability, ecological health and social justice at the very centre of their lives. In Bangalore, former ad woman and filmmaker Jenny Pinto has created a niche for herself by making lamps from agricultural waste. Her philosophy is an integrated one, as is her workshop, using a closed-loop approach to water use, where no water is wasted.
I do my own range of lamps, which I don't outsource it at all. We make the paper here, I design lights. Paper making requires a lot of water. All my water is recycled, whether it's the sewage or paper making. So it just goes through a series of holding tanks and reed beds, using waste material, recycling my water, using as few chemicals as possible, and also in terms of energy consumption to keep it as low as possible. Really, India can in many ways lead this change, because I think this was our traditional knowledge of never throw out, use everything again, recycle, repair. To me also a big dream has been to bring the small entrepreneur into the mainstream. Paper can be made from any fiber. So seeing what is available in their environment, then how they can use those raw materials with the least amount of use of power or water.
Eco-architect S. Vishwanath is another entrepreneur with a holistic vision of how human society and economy should fit within ecological realities. The home he has built just outside Bangalore is a testament to sustainable living. It's not only carbon neutral, it's water positive, generating more water than it uses. It also benefits local biodiversity, creating wild spaces and water pools for the resident birds and wildlife, integrating them into its very design concept.
It's an ecological home. It's built out of earth, and we dug the earth from the site itself. We put in a basement, or a cellar as it's called, scooped out the mud, packed it into blocks on the site and built the house. We then grabbed all the rainwater that falls on the rooftop, filtered it, and we store it in an underground sump tank. That gives us almost all the water that we need for the year, for all purposes. We looked at the roof, we found that there was enormous amount of solar energy coming in there. So we used solar cookers, solar water heaters, and solar photovoltaic panels to light up the home and provide the energy requirements. We also found out that the wastewater could be used up on the roof itself to grow rice. And so we got food security and we got wastewater security. And it's a lot of fun to find solutions. Hey, what more fun can there be than to have turtles and fish on your roof and rice growing in the fields up there, and then you go up in the morning and spend 15 minutes of your time. It's wonderful. There are 700 such homes all across India. It's a big movement. And people interact with their homes first. That's the built environment which immediately comes in front of their eyes. They would want to make that ecological if they're bothered about the environment. We have a tradition of well diggers. There's a community involved in this process, and wells have provided water all across India for centuries, for more than 3,000 years. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa have had wells in each one of the homes. These well diggers ran out of business because we drew the water so much that the groundwater table sank. But with rainwater harvesting, they now build what are called recharge wells. And all these wells recharge water into the aquifer and actually raise the water table. Here's a profession which would have died out were it not for an ecological practice that came into being in our society.
These examples all show what can be done in India. The energy, the drive, the imagination are all there in spades to transform our society. The question is, why is not more being done? And what can we do to get from here to there?
Let's not underestimate human ingenuity, and let's not underestimate the youth in India and their willingness to engage, and their willingness to invent, and their willingness to seek solutions. People on the ground in India are not creating, if you like, the tension for the politicians to make the changes that they need to make. At the end of the day, visionary leadership is quite rare. The days of Gandhi and Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel and Shastri are all gone. I mean, we don't get that kind of leadership anymore, where leaders thought and felt for the future and planned and designed strategies for the future. We kind of are more reactive in today's world. I see the opportunity, therefore, of leadership in the hands of people, of common people. Starting from the fact that, yes, the West is largely responsible for these emissions, we should argue the case why their trajectory on reduction should be higher and steeper than ours. but actually we should be presenting the proposals. And I think right now we are merely responding to their proposals, but not presenting our own.
One of the reasons why we have not made good progress on implementation is corruption. And unless we can actually bring about a movement with young people to say that we have zero tolerance to corruption, that this type of, if we are going to live our lives in any way, and we have to put up with corruption at every level, it's not on.
Climate change is often painted as an issue of equity and social justice. This is undoubtedly true. The poorest in our society are the least to blame and the hardest hit. Securing just outcomes for them and securing their livelihoods will be essential. Yet equity is not only social, it's intergenerational. Those with the most to lose will be future generations. As a young nation, with more than 70% of our population under 40, India has a lot at stake. This film has emphasized the importance of 2009 as the make or break year on climate change. The science is telling us that we now have less than 10 years to make the shift. If we leave it any later than that, we run great risk of runaway climate change and further catastrophe, which will be more costly. If we're serious about solutions, we cannot expect business as usual. This film has profiled some of the innovators from India, people who can lead and should play a greater role. Climate change is a global problem requiring a global partnership. Here in India too, the mood is changing. There is a growing sense of confidence that we too can play a role in finding the solution. Indeed, that we can play a role in leading, not just expecting others to do so.
2009 must be a game-changing year. If COP15 is to succeed, which it must, we will require a change from politics as usual. Can business help break the logjam? Can new alliances be formed and new positions embraced? This film shows emerging leadership in India. These are some of the people who can help create the political will for change and provide many of the solutions we need. But there must be no more delays. The time for action is now.